Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about the Sony ZV-E10 and if it's a great camera for live streaming.
Be seen, heard, and better understood through virtual gatherings. Elevate your message with corporate streams.
Now, like a lot of other cameras, the naming conventions are very frustrating and very annoying. So ZV-E10, why? I don't know. But hey, we're talking about this camera today. It's newly announced. We'll see what kind of specs it has, and we'll talk about whether it's good or not for live streaming. Let me start off right away. If you want a quick summary of this video, it does have some pretty great specs. It is a very capable camera, and I would definitely suggest this camera if you are live streaming. There are some really cool built-in tools in the camera that help with live streaming, and we'll talk about that in the full-length video. So if you're ready to jump into the weeds with me, let's go ahead and talk about some of the specs and what works and what doesn't work well for this camera. Okay, so looking at the ZV-E10, we have two different colors, so that's always good. The price point without the lens is $698. That's really, really solid. And if we look at it with the lens, it's $798. Would I recommend this lens? It's a 16 to 50. So the range of the lens is actually pretty solid, but the f-stop is the thing that gets you. So the get you on that lens is a 3.5 to a 6.3. So what does that mean? Well, when a lens is listed with a range of f-stop, that 3.5 to 6.3, that means that that lens doesn't have a through stop. So as you zoom in on that lens, the f-stop has to go smaller because it's a cheaper lens. It's not designed to have a through stop where the widest and the tightest image has the same f-stop throughout that lens. And so you're not going to get that shallow depth of field that you would be expecting. Most of your background and things would be in focus. Whereas on the contrary, I have a 20mm prime. It's a 1.8. I believe this is about 2.4 currently. And you'll see that I am pretty much in focus and the background is out of focus. So with this stock lens, the one that comes with the camera, you're not going to get that shallow depth of field. But if you're not about that and you just want a simple video setup, then this would probably work just fine for you. And just know that when you zoom out all the way, the lowest f-stop you'll get is a 3.5. So if you want to learn more about f-stops and how cameras work, I am working on a Stream Basics series on my channel. The next video that's going to be coming out is actually all about cameras. And so we'll break down the different elements of the camera and how it works. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but if you want to check that out, go ahead and do the YouTube thing, subscribe to the channel and all that fun stuff, and you can learn all about that in the future. Okay, so moving on, my suggestion would be to go with a prime lens depending on what you're shooting. The 16 to 50 is an average, below average lens. So if you can skip it, save yourself $100. A black body versus the white body, that's gonna be totally up to you on your personal preference. I like the classic black look, so I would lean into that. Going down the spec list, let's start with the top spec here. It's 24 APS-C CMOS sensor. That is a mouthful. That's a lot of different words in there. The short of it is it's an APS-C sensor. So it's kind of a medium-sized sensor. And I know in the B&H video, they are touting how large and how great the sensor is. The reality is you can look at sensors. For mirrorless cameras, the largest sensor you can typically get right now is called a full-frame sensor, and then APS-C is probably about 50% smaller than that, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'll show a nice handy chart that illustrates this, and you'll see the different sizes. A full-framed sensor gives you a much shallower depth of field. It basically allows more light in. It also creates a better depth of field. And so generally speaking, the larger the sensor, the more expensive the camera is, but also the better the image is going to be. Now with video, the standard for a very long time was 2/3 inch sensor, which is pretty tiny. And then now the standard is pretty much a 1-inch sensor for most video cameras or camcorders, whereas photography cameras or DSLRs tend to be either APS-C or full frame. So this will also be a topic of discussion on the channel. So this is just a simple summary of that. So I will fully unpack this in another video, but that is kind of the summary of it. For me, an APS-C sensor is actually a really good sweet spot. It's very similar to my FS5, which is a super 35mm sensor, is the equivalent of what a film camera used to be right before digital took over. So that's a lot of information on that 24.2 megapixel sensor. Now, megapixels aren't the only thing that matters. There are other things like color depth and other things, but we won't get into that. It does have a 3-inch flip out touchscreen LCD. So that's actually really cool. You can flip the screen to the side. That way you can see it as you're filming yourself. So So in this current recording, I'm using an A7R4 and I cannot see myself. So I have to set it up and pray that everything works out. But with this new camera, I could actually see myself as I'm recording, which is pretty awesome. We have up to 11 frames a second for shooting. That is incredibly fast. That means you can shoot 24 megapixel photos 11 times a second. Now that doesn't say continuous or anything like that. So I'm wondering if there's a buffer. I'll see if that is noted further down in the list here. And then your ISO range is between 100 and 32,000. So that has a decent low range capabilities, but it's not going to be as good as like an A7 III or one of the more expensive mirrorless cameras. So this does tout a background defocus or a face priority auto exposure. We'll talk about that in a minute. It does sound like an interesting perk, but there is a little bit of a caveat to it, and we'll get into that in a minute. It does have headphone and microphone ports, which is great, so you can hear and have a microphone in, which would be my suggestion as well. It can shoot in ultra high definition 4K at 30 frames a second, and it can do full HD at 120 frames a second. So this camera really reminds me of an A6300 and A6400, somewhere in that ballpark, but it's priced much cheaper, almost half the price of those cameras when they were originally released. And so this camera has some great features. It has 425-point hybrid autofocus detection, which basically means that it's gonna focus very, very well depending on your subjects. One thing I want to know about this camera, and really about cameras in general, half of it is the camera, but the other half is the lens choice, or are the lens choices. And so there are 65 lenses that can go with this particular camera. I would suggest, depending on what you're shooting, to go with a prime lens if you want that high quality, shallow depth of field look versus a zoom lens, especially the kit lens like we talked about earlier. And one of my favorite lenses of all time is the 2.8 70 to 200 millimeter lens, which basically allows you to get those zoomed in portrait looks, those really high quality, crisp images. But of course, that lens is like $2,000 or $2,400 depending on the brand that you get. So yes, there's an investment in a camera, but you also got to consider there will be an investment in your lenses and the lens choices that you make. And it's really going to depend on the style of video that you're shooting. So depending on the type of videos that you are producing, obviously the gear is going to revolve around that. So do me a favor, leave me a comment below and tell me what you are shooting, and I will do my best to go through those comments and pick out a few and make videos around what I would suggest as far as gear and stuff goes for your particular situation. All right, moving through here, we have real-time eye autofocus and tracking. This is both for animals and for humans, which is pretty cool. And then you have a directional 3 capsule mic and windscreen on the top of the camera. To be honest with you, I watched the video and here's a quick sample of what that sounds like.
All right, so we're outside today at Domino Park here on the East River in New York City, testing out the ZV-E10.
I was not very impressed with this. This seems like a nice feature, but when it comes down with it with audio, the key thing that you got to remember, the closer the microphone is to your source, which is your mouth, the better the quality of the audio is going to be. So, and the other thing is, the larger the capsule is, the better the quality is. And these are all generally speaking, right? So if you have a handheld microphone and it's right next to your mouth, or if you have an SM7B, right, that large diaphragm microphone, and it's close to your mouth, that's going to give you the highest sound quality. And then next would be a lav, which you'll see this is what, 4 to 6 inches away. And then the least effective thing would be a microphone that's on the camera, let alone a built-in microphone, because the quality just drops at each one of those steps. So even though this is available and they're trying to tout this as a cool new feature, honestly, it's not really a selling point for me. So we're gonna go through and skip all this marketing fluff that you see and all this text here, and I'm just gonna focus on those key details that we're talking about. And we've kind of listed the main things. So we have that rear 3-inch LCD screen, so that's really good. 3 inches is pretty standard for the size. In my particular situation, I'm using my hot shoe to hold the receiver for this wireless mic, and I'm plugging in the microphone to my camera. I will take a snapshot. That way you can see what my particular setup is for this recording. I do love that you have the microphone jack and the headphone jack so you can monitor audio as you're going. So that's always a plus. And something that's new to these cameras is there is a front tally that tells you whether you're recording or not. I think that is genius. I really love that. I wish they would basically do a firmware update and update the full Sony lineup with something like that. But hey, they may not have that little red tally light indicator. What would also be cool is if that tally light worked with the Blackmagic A10 Mini, which is a video switcher and encoder. So that would be a super powerful combination to have this camera with a tally light that gets controlled through HDMI. We'll see if that becomes a feature or not, but that is not discussed anywhere in the literature of this product. I do also like the red border that shows up on the LCD screen when you're recording. That seems like a pretty smart feature as well to make it nice and clear that you are recording. Sometimes the little REC is hard to see, especially if you're in a weird angle or what have you. Even though you can flip up the screen, especially if you're in bright sunlight, hopefully that will be nice and clear and easy to see. So here's the thing that interests me the most. It says live streaming is possible directly from the camera simply by connecting the camera to a computer or compatible mobile device via USB, allowing the camera's video and audio capabilities to be used for live social media and video conferencing. UVC and UAC standards are supported for improved picture and sound quality during streaming. So this is basically tethering your camera to a computer via USB. In my experience, this is not the best way to do this. Plugging a camera into the computer via USB basically depends on the hardware of the camera to do that processing and coding. And so the video quality tends to suffer through this method. So like I mentioned before, using a product like an A10 Mini, there is a HDMI D, which is a micro HDMI cable. I would plug that in and basically go out to your switcher, make sure that the display is turned off so that the HDMI output isn't there. And that would probably be the best way of getting a signal out of the camera. Now, I might be totally wrong on this. It depends on if Sony has done any magic or anything new to increase the connectivity between the camera via USB. But from what I've seen so far in every other iteration of this through, the A7R4 or the A7 III, other cameras, the image quality through USB just isn't quite there yet. So Sony, if you're listening to this, hopefully in the future you'll have a better solution to this. If there is an improvement, if I do see a noticeable difference, I will pin that in a comment below. But so far, I think HDMI tends to be the best option, even though it is an extra step and you need an extra tool with you as well to do that. Now it is a USB Type-C or USB 3.1 port on the camera, so hopefully that will make a difference. But now as far as UVC and UAC standards, there's not a lot of information online, but from what I can tell, the highest resolution you can get is 720p out of that USB. So once again, HDMI seems to be the best option. So it does have some special shooting modes. One of the things is this product showcase. So basically you can hold an object up to the camera. It will know to go into macro focus mode. Basically it will go and focus on the object that's closest to it first and then go back to your face, and it'll know or anticipate that movement. So it knows that you're gonna do that. I think that could be a super, super useful thing, especially if you're showing off makeup, showing off lenses, that kind of thing. So I'm excited to see how that plays out with different people and how they use that tool. It can also be super annoying. So I would basically keep that off unless you're intentionally trying to get something there, because I bet you the chances of the lens hunting for focus will increase when it's expecting an object to come into shallow frame here, but nothing shows up. So we'll see if that becomes an issue as well. So this background to focus thing can be a really interesting thing if you don't really know the settings in your camera. So this might be very good for a beginner who's just starting to learn out and they want that shallow depth of field. They're like, how do I achieve that? So let me read the description here. Background to focus lets you immediately switch to the maximum aperture setting of the attached lens using a custom button function for isolating your subject using shallow depth of field and bokeh. So that's basically doing an automatic iris adjustment. Now in their sample video, they did this automatic iris adjustment and it did accomplish what they wanted to. It did give you that shallow depth of field, but the compromise there was the exposure became off, right? So the face and the highlights was overexposed and you lost the detail in those sections. So that is something I'm sure they'll try to fix in a firmware update, because with cameras, there are three things that affect the exposure. It's gonna be the f-stop, the shutter speed, and the ISO, right? So those three things, if you change one, it's gonna affect the other two if you wanna keep this exposure the same. So they're gonna have to figure out a way to do this background defocus and then also change those other parameters, which basically means you're putting it in aperture priority mode, right? By that one touch of a button. The aperture priority basically means that you want that number to come first and those other two numbers would adjust to fit the needs of the look that you're going for. The short of it is, I would encourage you to learn your camera and the specs and how those three relate to each other. That way you can actually understand what your camera is doing instead of depending on something that is automatically sorted for you or fixed for you, especially if that fix or that setting that you go into actually negatively affects your image by overexposing. So that would be my suggestion. Don't use that background defocus and just learn your camera. And going back to that lens choice that we talked about earlier, if your lens only goes to a 6.3 f-stop when you're zoomed in all the way, that means you're not gonna get that shallow depth of field, or it's gonna be very, very hard to get that shallow depth of field. Okay, I could talk about this all day. Let's just try to keep moving here. So they have face priority autofocus. So obviously it detects your face and tries to make sure that the exposure and the face are depicted at an ideal brightness. That's typically what you want to do, is you want to make sure your face is properly exposed. For my particular situation, I actually have my camera set to underexpose the overall image. That way I make sure that my face stays correctly exposed, and then I could possibly bump that up in post-production if I absolutely needed to. So that again is like my manual way of doing what this camera can do automatically with that setting. The face priority for focusing is a huge deal. I think obviously when you're shooting subjects, the eye, the face is the most important part, right? So we want to make sure that that stays in focus the whole time. And it also basically will auto expose to the face, right, with this setting. Basically, if you're doing a moving shot or a vlog, it'll try to prioritize the face and make sure that it is exposed well, and your background will maybe underexposed or overexposed depending on the situation. It has the soft skin effect that can be used to soften or smooth wrinkles or blemishes on a subject's face to create a natural smooth complexion. We'll see how well this works. I'm a dude, I don't really care about those blemishes as much, so it might be helpful for a vlogger or somebody who cares about having perfect skin and having a good look like that. That is also something that could be done with filters and in post-production. But if it works well, then maybe that saves us a few steps, right? Saves somebody a few steps to do it all in camera. It has off, low, mid, and high settings for that. So you'll have to play with that to see how well that works for you. This is interesting. In notes here, for longer takes, extended continuous video recording, it's available when the auto power off temperature function is set to high. So basically it knows that the camera is going to get hot and it tries to protect itself and shuts itself off. That's what happens with a lot of these mirrorless and smaller cameras, is they don't have built-in fans, and so they don't have a good way of cooling themselves off. So they often overheat. You could basically set the shut-off setting to high, which will prolong how long the camera stays rolling for. The compromise there is it's not necessarily that great for your camera, and those auto settings are supposed to protect those electronics or those internal components of the camera. Movie footage can be tagged with specific metadata to indicate vertical recording orientation for direct playback on smartphone apps and other instances where vertical video playback is needed. So that's kind of cool that it tags the metadata of the orientation, whether that's landscape with traditional video, right, versus horizontal or vertical video. I'm a traditional shooter. I 9 times out of 10 will prefer a landscape over vertical, but hey, you got to shoot to the audience, right? You got to give them what they're looking for. Image quality, autofocus, and 4K video. So we talked about the sensor size. It does have an expanded ISO of 51,000, and the Sony lineup just in general, they have a remarkable and incredible low light performance, so we'll see if that carries over to this new camera. It does tote that the sensor is about 3 times larger than a 1-inch sensor. That is true with all APS-C sensors, going back to the chart that we talked about earlier. The 1-inch sensor is the modern standard for camcorder or video sensors, and that's been widely improved from the older 2/3 inch sensor and even smaller for cheaper cameras. APS-C is about 3 times larger than that, and then the best of the best, the cream of the crop, so to speak, right now is a full framed sensor. It does have a Bionics X processor. Combination also avails top continuous shooting rate of 11 frames a second with autofocus and auto exposure, permits a 14-bit RAW file output and a wide tonal color scale. So I guess it's saying that 11 frames a second can be shot in RAW, so that's pretty cool. It doesn't tell you if it's continuous or if it shuts off after a buffer, so we'll have to see what that does. So it does have 425 points of autofocus via hybrid. That basically covers the image, right, and gives you all those different points for autofocus so that it can track your face and go wherever you go for that focus point. Focus system covers 84% of the sensor. Okay, so not all, but most of the sensor. 84% is pretty solid. Capable of achieving focus as little as 0.02 seconds. So that's incredibly fast. We'll see how well it performs on this camera. And like we talked about before, autofocus for the eye is prioritized for animals and humans, so we'll see how that goes. It also has algorithms, right, software within the camera that can track movements and kind of predict that movement for the eyes so that we stay in focus in real time. All right, so let's talk about recording modes. It can do 4K Ultra HD recording at 30 frames a second, and it does oversample. So what that means is the sensor is 6K of resolution. It records in 4K, so it downsamples that, right? So it actually gives you a sharper image when you downsample, and that happens across a few cameras where it downsizes that sample rate and gives you better clarity and sharpness in that 4K recording. And it's supposed to be able to reduce moire or aliasing. So moire is when you have a tight pattern on a screen and you see that kind of weird shift that happens. So this oversampling is supposed to help with that moire and other aliasing. For full HD 1080p recording, it's also supported up to 120 frames a second, which is awesome. And both resolutions utilize 100 megabit per second XAVC-S format. So that That is basically Sony's proprietary recording format that's built within the camera. And so depending on the level of camera, that XAVC will have a different flavor, right? A different quality of compression, which gives more or less detail. And so the AVC-S format has an MP4 wrapper and it's a 420 sampling. So it's a lot of technical jargon, but the short of that is it's not the highest quality compression format that there is. It's okay at best. And 100 megabits per second, it's okay, but it's not going to compare to a high quality movie recording or something like that, right? So in addition to the high resolution internal recording, uncompressed HDMI output also enables the use of an optional external recorder for a clean 4K recording with 422 sampling. So 422 gives you a little bit more color space because of the way it samples. The short of it is 422 is better than 420 and 444 is even better than that. And having that clean 4K output is awesome for an external recorder, and also it's great for when you're live streaming through an ATEM Mini. Now, one thing I do want to note is with the ATEM Mini, it cannot see a 4K signal. So you got to make sure within that camera setting that it is set to 1080p or your camera will not be recognized by the ATEM Mini. So a little note for that. It does have slow and quick mode, which allows you to capture full HD, but again, between up to 120 frames a second, and the slow is 1 frame a second. Why would you want 1 frame a second? Well, that basically puts it in time-lapse mode. So you can do an action and record in a time-lapse for that. Here's a big perk. There is no limit for movie recording, allowing you for longer takes and uninterrupted shooting for live events. That is pretty impressive, especially for a $700 camera. The only caveat there is the overheating thing we've talked about. There are a few things that you can do to try to mitigate this overheating. Number one is if you get a battery bank, it will basically take the heat out of the battery compartment, which is within the camera, and put it within the extra battery grip slot, right? That has those 2 extra batteries. That I've seen help. Turning down the brightness of the LCD screen can help, and shading your camera so it's not in direct sunlight. All those things can help. So we'll see if setting the shutdown rate to high and also trying to do those steps to protect it, we'll see how long that this camera can actually record for. But having the ability to not have a limit on the record rate is pretty incredible. And speaking of that, I'm going to take a break, stop my camera, and start it again. So I was 32 minutes in with the A7R4 and I didn't have that interruption, so that's good. I think everything is still in good shape. Actually, let me check my audio. Yeah, so that's one of those things when you shoot with a mirrorless, you just have to check every once in a while. That's what I did now. Affording extensive customizable color and gamma controls. Yeah, so basically it's talking about the picture profiling, and so you do have some of these features where you can adjust the black level, the knee, the color level, and more. It has S-Log2, which is a gamma curve, which is generally found in high-end Sony cameras, and it is included in this one, which allows you to have up to 1,300% more dynamic range than traditional 709, and it has a hybrid log gamma. So basically, if you want to get the most out of your camera, you should research these things and learn about S-Log2, S-Log3, those kind of things, and see what you can do with that dynamic range to get the most out of your camera. To be honest with you, if you're just shooting for YouTube, if you're shooting for a business or for a vlog, you probably don't need to worry about that high dynamic range. But if you're a super nerd and you want to get the most out of your camera, feel free to do that research and utilize those tools that you have available to you. Again, you can do time-lapse mode within the camera. Intervals can be selected between 1 and 60 seconds, and you can do up to 9,999 sequential free. So basically, you can do up to almost 10,000 pictures, just shy of 10,000 pictures in a row in a time-lapse. Ooh, also in-camera battery charging is possible via the USB port while using a portable battery to benefit long and interval shooting sessions. So that's super awesome. So you can plug your camera into a USB power bank, and that will charge your battery plus power the camera. That's pretty impressive. That's a really good thing to have so that you can have extended battery life. All right, 2 more sections to go. We're plowing through this one. Let's talk about the camera body design. It is built for portable applications, one-handed use, and incorporates a large right-hand grip for intuitive physical control layout. I know the smaller the camera, for me at least, the more frustrating it can be. There's more shake. I like to describe an empty water bottle versus a full water bottle. So we'll see if this compact camera does well. I actually don't even really like the A7R4 size. I prefer my FS5 and larger bodies, but I've been shooting for 15 years. Everybody's got a preference, and that's just mine. We talked about the front-facing LCD. Now, this camera also has an integrated zoom lever. So what I would be curious to know is if this camera can zoom with the 18-105 f4. That would be pretty impressive to have that capability on such a small camera and have a high-quality lens like that. I would even be curious to see if it would work with the Sony broadcast lenses, which are the 28-135 or the 18-110. Obviously these lenses are super expensive compared to the body, but the combo would probably be pretty interesting, especially if that zoom rocker works on the camera. I wonder if in the menu you can set the speed of that zoom, which could be helpful. And you could probably pick up these lenses used for about half the original price, especially the 2nd gen. If you're like me and you're thrifty, you might want to look into that as well. And this power zoom feature, I actually wished was on multiple cameras, like the A7R IV, right? The other Sony cameras. I would love for that feature to be extended. The record button, right, the tally record, I would love for that to be extended to future products as well. So good job, Sony. Keep coming out with innovative ways to make your cameras better. So if you want to quickly turn off the camera, you basically fold in the screen and that's it. That reminds me here, I don't think there is a viewfinder. Yeah, there is no viewfinder on this camera. It is all about the screen. So basically, as soon as you fold in that screen, that is it. And you know what, while we're here, let's look at a few buttons here. So on the front, a single switch here, that's your zoom, your tight and your wide. You do have a shutter button on top. You have your camera release button here in the tally. You do have your textured grip here on the front. Sony branding, of course. Let's look at the back of this camera. You have your hot shoe on top, your LCD, which folds out and rotate like we talked about. You have a menu button function, the display with a wheel. So this can go up, down, left, or right, and it can scroll left or scroll right. Playback and trash, which most of these buttons are pretty much where you would expect them. You do have a secondary wheel here on the top, and once we go to the top view, we'll see what that looks like. That's with the LCD folded out, which is pretty cool. Bottom just has a lock or open with a 1/4-20 thread at the bottom. Looking at the top, you have an on and off switch, and you have your mode, which is photos, camera, or S&Q, which is slow and quick motion. You do have a record button, which is separate than your shutter button, right? Your photo button versus your record button. So it's interesting to think that it has both a photo mode and a video mode, plus a record button and a shutter button or a photo button, right? So I wonder if you're in video mode, if you can take photos, or if you're in photos, you can do video by just pressing the button. We'll see. You do have a custom button here at the top, so you can basically program through that to a specific thing. And then you have another wheel here that helps basically dial in different settings. So it has a dedicated movie record, background to focus, product showcase, S&Q buttons, provide all direct access to common features used by vloggers. So it says that it has these dedicated buttons for each of these, but we looked at the camera itself. I didn't see a background to focus button or a product showcase button. I guess those can be programmed through that custom button. Let's take one more look at the body and just make sure that I'm not wrong about this. Yeah, unless this is somehow, yeah, the product button, that could be that. And then I guess that could be for the horizontal flip would be that function button. So I guess they're dual purpose buttons, but yeah, so I guess dedicated movie, record, background to focus, product showcase, S&Q buttons, all direct access. So I guess the buttons are on the camera, so they're there. Now what's included is an MP FW50 battery, rated for up to 440 shots and approximately 125 minutes of recording per charge. MP FW50 is a battery that's shared across multiple cameras, so I'll put that in the lower third and show you which cameras can take that same battery. So if you already have another camera and you have these other batteries, then you might have batteries that will fit this camera already, which is kind of cool. All right, and finally we're talking about wireless and sharing. So it has a built-in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connectivity, which enables it to instantly transfer images over to mobile devices for direct sharing and uploading to social networks via email or to a cloud storage sites. Once connected, the mobile device can display a live view image on the screen, and using a smartphone remote control can remotely control the camera shutter release. So basically you can download an app and control the camera via that remote. I personally would not suggest trying to transfer over Wi-Fi. I have a feeling that that's going to be extremely slow. And so if you have the ability, pull out the SD card and transfer it via computer, because that's going to be a much faster throughput. And the ZV-E10 is also compatible with the movie edit add-on feature from the Imaging Edge mobile app. So basically you can buy an app and edit over your phone if that's something that's interesting to you. Bluetooth connectivity enables connecting the optional wireless shooting grip for efficient camera control. So we talked about that too. It's going to basically wirelessly talk between the grip and the camera. All right, we covered a lot of good information about this ZV-E10. My overall impression is it is a very solid camera, and it'll do very well as an entry-level streaming camera for you, paired with a proper lens and proper audio equipment. 2 thumbs up for this camera, and it checks a lot of boxes for me. One thing I didn't mention is it doesn't talk about built-in image stabilization in the notes here. It does talk about it in the video, but from what I saw in that video preview is it's not a 5-axis stabilization, probably a software-based stabilizer. So I wouldn't depend on that a lot. I would encourage you to have a gimbal or some sort of steady rig that will help stabilize that if you're doing any sort of moving shots. But if you're not, if you're keeping the camera on a little mini tripod or on your desk or that kind of thing, then you probably don't need that stabilization. So hopefully this video has informed you and helped you make the decision whether you want the ZV-E10 or not. Thanks for checking this out. If you want to see more from us, go ahead and do that YouTube thing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.